네, 안녕하십니까?
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Reboot Korea 2022, which is being hosted, brought to you by NRC and KDI. My name is Kang Ji-hye. I'll be your MC. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us here today. This symposium is being held under the theme of Reboot Korea 2022, where we are taking a new leap forward. We can discuss many new initiatives and many directions forward on economy, on balanced growth, national inclusion, regulation. And in fact, we have 5 different sessions, and they will be hosted by lead institutions and think tanks in Korea, where we will have the opportunity to hear from renowned thinkers across the world. With this, we begin this 3rd session on new paradigm for regulatory innovation. For this, we will be learning more about what we can do for effective regulation and the implementation of effective regulation, which is why we have titled this New Paradigm for Regulatory Innovation. We do have experts and analysts from different think tanks and public research institutions in Korea who will be talking about the assignments and the challenges in regulation, looking at the current status and the future steps going forward for regulatory innovation. This is session 3, New Paradigm for Regulatory Innovation. I'd like to first of all introduce our moderator as well as the presenters and panelists. First of all, please welcome our moderator, Kae-hong Kim, President of the Korea Legislation Research Institute. We have 2 presenters today. Professor at the Law School at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, Mr. Seung-pil Choi. We have Vice President of Innovation and Dean of the Graduate School at RAND, Nancy Stout. We have 3 panelists with us today. The first panelist is from KDI, Director Yong-hyun Yang, the Center for Regulatory Studies. We also have Jong-han Lee, Director at the Division of Regulatory Innovation Research at the Korea Institute of Public Administration. Also, from the Korea Legislation Research Center, Yong-hyuk Cho, Director of Regulatory Legislation Research Center. Now we will kick off session 3 in earnest. I'd like to hand over the microphone over to our chair and moderator for the session.
원장님 진행 부탁드립니다.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Yes, hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kae-hong Kim. I'm the president of Korea Legislation Research Institute. We're here to discuss the theme of new paradigm for regulatory innovation. When I ask myself what regulation means to me, I believe I actually started in working on regulation back during the time of the Kim Tae-jung administration. It was the Framework Act on regulation. And at the time, we talked about maybe getting rid of about 50% of the regulation. At the time, we, as a researcher and an analyst, we were looking at all of the different regulations that were maybe not needed. And so we try to take a quantitative outlook and try to decrease regulation by 50%. And in fact, I think every administration, there was a lot of regulatory reform. Many people thought that it would not cost us any money, but we can also allow for innovation to thrive, that we can respect autonomy and independence. And this is a way for us to go forward in that regard. In the past administration, we've pivoted from quantitative to a qualitative approach to try to also adopt regulatory sandbox, and we've tried to do that. And under this current administration, President Yoon has also said that regulatory innovation is one of the priority policy goals. That is also what the Prime Minister has said as well, that regulatory innovation really needs to be the framework for all of our policies. That is why we are here to discuss this theme on regulatory innovation. We do have 2 presenters today. and I had the opportunity to read their presentation materials ahead of time. They were quite interesting, but they look at the issue from different approaches. So that would be very interesting. And also we have three panelists, all from different think tanks in Korea, and I understand that the three panelists represent think tanks that are working together on regulatory innovation tasks. In fact, these think tanks have signed an MOU on a government project for regulatory innovation. So I think that their panel discussion is going to be quite creative and meaningful for all of us. I would like to give about 25 minutes to each of our presenters, and we do have three panelists. And I think that there might be some questions from the floor, and we also have to turn for answers. So perhaps you can limit your remarks to the panelists for 8 minutes. So I'd like to turn to Mr. Choi, first of all.
Hello, everyone. As has been introduced, I am Seung-pil Choi, professor at Law School of Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. For the past 15 years, I've been working closely with the institutes on legislative research. So it is my honor to be presenting at this prestigious conference hosted by research institutes in Korea. I have many slides that I've prepared, but I have to limit my presentation to 25 minutes, so I'm going to mainly focus on some of the key points. This is the main points of my presentation. When you think about the study of law, you can think about you can define it as a research discipline on the roles and responsibilities of the state. So I like to talk about the definition of risk and how it should be regulated. Because when you think about regulations, let's say regulations were failed, then you know that the state has not fulfilled its obligation to protect the life and safety of the citizens. So in that sense, you can consider that as a failure of the policy and failure of the state. And when there is a failure of the regulation, there should be proper damage compensation. But if that doesn't happen, and if there's no reprimand or any recovery of the rights, then this is once again the failure of the state to protect the citizens. So once again, the responsibility of the state is core of the regulation. And in the past, through discussions and policies, we have been considering these aspects. But we may not have had enough legal discussion. If there was enough legal discussion in the process of formulating a new regulation, that this would have been very helpful. But that was not the case. Let's say that there's a regulation, and we have many regulations, and we have had improvements in terms of regulations, but I wonder if such regulations resulted in the desired outcome. So this is something that we need to think about. Let's say there's a new situation where you need a new regulation, and a new regulation is now implemented. But then it may be that there may be an accident or damage to consumers. Then such cases may lead to legal lawsuits, and in such cases the state may lose, or there may be some cases of illegal activities or violation of laws. Then in this process we may have to revise the regulations. Then we may see backstep or lack of progress in terms of regulations. So we need to really think about the role or definition of a risk or a danger as part of regulation. You can see that Article 10 of the Constitution defines the basic right or obligation of the state to protect citizens. So what does it mean? It means that the state has to have enough and sufficient regulations to ensure that citizens' rights are all protected, but we do not know to what extent such regulations have to be set. Unless there's a legal case, we may not know exactly to what extent. And from the perspective of government officials, those who set regulations, those who enforce regulations, they may have a different perspective. By improving regulations, there may be, of course, value added for society, but when regulations fail, there may be some of the disadvantages that these government officials have to endure. I worked in the public sector for 15 years, and for these 15 years, what I felt was that, let's say I took a risk and I did something, it was not rewarded. But if I made even a very small mistake, then there was a lot of punishment and discipline imposed upon me. Then what would I do as a government official? I would try to avoid any mistakes, or I would try not to make mistakes rather than trying to make some progress, because there will be consequences of not doing something right. Some say that we should give more discretion and authority to government officials so that they could devise better regulations. And some say that we need to give more freedom and autonomy to government officials. But if there's no protection or immunity for government officials in terms of regulations, they may not go beyond what they would normally do. So it is not sure whether positive administrative system will lead to immunity. There's no specific standard or criteria for immunity in case of any failure, any problem. So having to think about this aspect already is stressful for government officials. In the study of law, you can think about the definition of danger. And so you need to follow the German tradition of law. When you look at the administrative law of Germany, you can see that this is from the Faustian police law. And if the state fails to intervene and protect the citizens, then it will be the failure of the state. So the state has to be responsible for protecting their citizens from dangers. And such a danger is defined as a situation where imminent harm is expected. So about 5-6 years ago, this concept of danger was applied in Korea. But now with the COVID-19 pandemic, which began in China, in just a couple of days, the virus spread to Korea. And then we had a large number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 right away. And also, you can think about the global financial crisis that took place, that started in the US in 2007, but it quickly spread to Korea. And there are cyber risks. For instance, a DDoS attack will have huge implications, and cyber assets will have to be protected. Then there will be increasing cyber risks. So given these risks, the criteria of imminency is not something you can require, but rather we have to really imagine that any risks can spread really quickly. In Germany, they have a distinction between danger and risk, but nowadays there's no such distinction because anything dangerous can quickly spread. So I would like to argue that we should move away from the distinction between danger and risk, but rather we have to really go for regulating potential risks. Then the next question is, how are we going to respond to the risk? Regulations have to be in proportion to the size and the probability of the risk. So depending on how big the risk is, your level of regulation will be determined. Let's say that the risk is significant and is likely to occur, then not only post-regulation but also pre-regulation has to be put in place and civil liability will arise. But there's another thing that you need to think about, which is about the development of risk prevention technology. Our public sector R&D in Korea is actually very high compared to the global average. However, there's not much R&D or research on risk prevention technology. During the Industrial Revolution in the US, there were many coal miners. So coal mining industry was booming. So miners would go inside and they would have to rely on some lamps and gas, and these gases and lamps will spark explosion, and this led to major accidents. So at that time, they realized that it would take 1 month or 2 months before all the gases, the remaining gas, would disappear. And at that time, the Royal Academy of the the UK had a great idea. If they could develop or invent a lamp that they could safely bring inside the coal mining tunnels, then this would be wonderful. And in just a couple of days, a new lamp was invented that miners could bring into the mining areas. So they were able to start mining right away without having to wait for a couple of months for all the gases to disappear. So how should we respond to risks? We have to think about the development of risk prevention technology. How much are we investing in this? So for type 1, type 2, and type 3, I'm not going to cover all of them, but in conclusion, you can see that the principle of proportionality has to be applied as a principle of risk control. And the more evidence and the more data you have, the higher or the better regulation you can devise. In the traditional discussion of regulation, there are several limits that we need to overcome. There's an issue of the distinction between economic and social regulation, but certain regulations may be viewed as economic regulations for companies, but these may be viewed as social regulations for the sake of environment. Because let's say if companies have to invest more in environmental facilities, their bottom line will be affected. But the lack of such environmental facilities may lead to the lack of safety management for citizens. So making this distinction is not realistic. Secondly, we need to think about the issue of increasing efficiency through regulatory improvement. You may wonder why we do not have regulatory improvement or efficiency. In the past, we just focused on efficiency only, but that is not what we need to do. If we had been approaching regulation for the sake of our citizens' safety, then we would have had more progress. Think about the unfortunate consumer incidents in the past, and citizens got really upset when such harmful cases occurred. Then they would go to the National Assembly, then they would demand stronger regulations. And in reaction to such demands and protests from the public, then the government has no way but to implement stronger regulations. So we should not just focus on efficiency, but we should also focus on effectiveness of regulations. If we had done that, then we would not have had inefficient or ineffective regulations. So I would like to argue that we should put more priority on effectiveness rather than efficiency. Now I would like to talk about the negative regulation. In the past, in the previous administration, they talked about inclusive negative regulation. So inclusive or comprehensive, what does it mean? This means that a comprehensive negative regulation will have a comprehensive list. But the comprehensiveness applies to the list, then this means that there is a very long list of things that will not be allowed by law. So the term has to be used with caution. In addition, we do not have any strong civil liability in place, so strong public regulation has to be applied. Otherwise, civil lawsuit is not easy and causality is not relaxed as well. So in civil lawsuit, you have the burden of proof and it takes a lot of effort and time and pressure. And in the American legal system, you may see that they have a very good system. So what is problem with the Korean legal system? But in the U.S. and the U.K., they have very strong basis for legal for civil liability. So this is something that we lack in Korea. And I make this joke quite often that there's this morning of Germany and evening of Spain. I lived in Germany and I lived in Spain as well. In Germany, they wake up really early in the morning, but in Spain, they start having dinner at 8 p.m. When you get up early in the morning, then you will be protective in the morning. You will be productive in the morning and you will be able to enjoy evening like in Spain. But then this will lead to a fewer hours of sleep, which will have a negative impact on your health. Likewise, just because there are some good practices in some countries doesn't mean that you can import them and implement them in your country, in your context right away. Now, I would like to discuss some of the legal discussions of regulatory improvement. We have the principle-based regulation, but this approach is not very successful because it hasn't been easy to find targets for principle-based regulation. If you want to have such principle-based regulation, you need to have good amount of data. You need to have evidence. Only then you can specify the scope of the regulation and the strength of the regulation. But this has not been easy because we didn't have enough data. So negative regulation was not an effective approach in Korea. In addition, there would be void of relief if liability is not involved. Now let's move on to the principle-based regulation, which is a recently popular regulatory approach. And the reason why principle-based regulations is receiving much attention is because it is appropriate for macro level regulation. Before the financial crisis in the US, we thought that it would be okay to manage or supervise companies at the micro level. But we learned our lessons from the global financial crisis that there was fear that was formed in the market when Lehman Brothers event took place, and it has spillover effect and the domino effect. So overseeing individual companies is not sufficient. You need to be more forward thinking in terms of responses to macro situations. You cannot make choices on a case by cases. You need to put in place a principle. And another issue is this big tech finance. Big tech companies are offering financial services. And when big tech and finance are combined, we don't know what will happen. And tech regulations and financial regulations are not really aligned. So in that sense, we need to apply a principle-based regulation. We need to offer a principle. But even in this way, we need to strengthen civil liability. Also, we need reasonable interpretation of the principle. Then, in order to interpret provisions of the law and to be interpreted at the court, it will take some time. And so there's this issue of the speed. And in addition, there's an issue of regulatory sandbox. There are several sandbox discussions that we have in Korea. And what we need to pay attention to here is how we are going to determine how innovative a certain business idea is. And there should be fairness and equality. And we need to have some justification to determine which ideas are innovative enough to deserve regulatory sandbox. And in the process of operating a regulatory sandbox, businesses are complaining that company A has gone into the regulatory sandbox with technology XX, but this technology is very common in our industry, but this company went into the regulatory sandbox first, ahead of other people. So there may be lawsuits filed by competitors. And another issue is about temporary permit. Actually, these are temporary permits, but they are considered as permanent permits. And until the relevant law is revised, the temporary permit will be extended forever. So what's the difference between the temporary permit and the regular permit? This is another issue that we need to address. And usually for the regulatory sandbox in Korea, it is for 2 years only, and extra 2 years can be granted. So after 4 years, there should be an exit, and we need to think about the orderly exit. Also, we need to think about compliance as a compliance. And for voluntary regulation, this is based on compliance rather than enforcement. But now, when it comes to the principle-based regulation 2.0, there may be an issue of companies setting their own regulations per se. And another big issue about compliance and regulation is consumer protection. And individual companies may respond to consumer protection. So nowadays, internal control standards are critical. So the issue here is how are we going to control, how are we going to manage internal control? When there was an incident about a scandal about Lyman Optimus, the financial institution's internal control was not properly functioning. It was up to them to apply internal control, but there was a problem in implementing the internal control mechanism. The compliance was not working well, so there was discipline and sanction. But then these companies filed administrative lawsuits. And the first and the second verdict, the Financial Services Commission lost the lawsuit because at that time they put in place a rule that effective internal control has to be placed. And companies argued that these internal control systems were effective, but the administrative agency saw that this was not effective. But the Supreme Court said that effective or essential can be interpreted differently, so it is not clear enough for the companies to put in place their internal control standards appropriately. So the supervisory authority lost all these cases. Now I would like to discuss some of the hidden key issues when it comes to regulatory enhancement. First of all, we have to think about the kinds of regulations that we have been trying to enhance. And for these regulations to stay relevant, we need to think about the legal aspect and the judicial judgment of these regulations. And if these efforts to enhance the regulations are not legal or not appropriate in terms of judicial judgment, then we should give up on that endeavor and try something else. So we need to consider that from the early stage. In the past, the government will say that permissions and licenses, and so far we've converted more than 400 regulations into registration. So you don't have to get approvals, you just have to report, you just have to get approval. So how is reporting and registration different from approval? Let's think about reporting system. The Supreme Court states that the formality of the reporting has to be done in a proper way. So there should be proper formality of the reporting. But in some other cases, the receipt has to be confirmed for reports. Then the basis of receipt is actually quite similar, fundamentally speaking, to getting an approval. So you may think that some regulations were improved because the approval system was converted into a reporting system or registration system, but when you examine them at the deeper level, they may not be very different in essence. And finally, I would like to discuss the level of regulatory standards. Let's say that there was an accident, there was illegal activity, so these may be subject to criminal litigation. Otherwise, other than these cases, we would want companies to do their job well without enforced regulations. There should be some consensus between the regulators and the companies. And you know that the capacities or uh, legal compliance capacities of large companies and smaller companies very different. So when you think about improving the regulations, there should be some negotiations and also some adjustments and coordination between the government agencies and the companies. If such a negotiation doesn't go well, then there may be forceful enforcement of a regulation. And before I conclude, I would like to say that so far we've had many discussions on regulatory enhancements. And when we take a look at the legal discussions, you may see that we only had some of the policy discussions and administrative discussions, but not so much of a legal discussions. And legal discussions were actually made at the last stage. Let's say that there is stew and you would put soft tofu in it, and tofu was legal discussion. So it was done at the later stage, but that's not the way we should go. What I would like to argue is that for regulations to be successful, we should make sure to control the judicial risks, the legal risks. What I mean by that is not just risks involving civil litigations and criminal litigations, but also other cases where human rights could be violated and the rights of citizens may be violated. And so, in all the legal situations where lawsuits can be filed and there may be plaintiffs and defendants and their arguments, and all these things have to be considered from the very early stage of devising a regulation. So, the message that I want to share with you is that policy discussions and policy directions have to be mingled and aligned with the legal discussion of regulations. Only then we can make progress in terms of policy regulation enhancement. And with that, I'd like to wrap up my presentation. Thank you.
네,
Thank you, Professor Choi. I gave you 25 minutes, but I never really had listened to a presentation that was so detailed and had a very in-depth discussions of the legal aspects of the regulatory enhancements. And thank you so much for sharing your ideas. You mentioned that we need to think about the legal risks, judicial risks of a regulation, and only then, only when we take them into account early on, we will be able to produce more effective regulations. And he also mentioned the importance of investing in risk prevention technology. Thank you.
낸시 스튜어트 랜드
Next, we'd like to hear from Vice President Nancy Stout of RAND. We'll give you 25 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I'm humbled and honored that you would invite me to speak at this amazing Reboot Korea 2022 conference. And I also agree very much with you, Professor Choi, and your view that the legal regulatory environment is incredibly important for innovation. And I'll make just a very brief comment on that in my presentation as well. First, let me introduce myself. I'm the Vice President of Innovation at the RAND Corporation. That stands for R&D. We are a think tank and a consulting firm, and we do work for clients across the world. We also have a graduate school, so I'm the Dean of the Graduate School at the RAND Corporation. It's a very unique arrangement where we sit inside the think tank, and our PhDs and master's students actually work on our client-related work and get paid for it. So as far as I know, we're the only graduate school that pays students to come to school and to work on policy problems. Today, I'm very excited to talk about innovation strategies in the context of COVID-19. And of course, what I'm going to talk about today is something we call in the United States Operation Warp Speed. But I know there have been many incredible innovations across the world in the context of COVID-19. Korea received extraordinary recognition early on for your soft power approach to containing the spread of COVID. Uruguay was given recognition for the tracking apps. China and the UK were given quite a bit of recognition for standing up field hospitals. Today, my focus will be on the United States and an operation that we put in place to discover the vaccine and how we went about it. First, let me share the background discussion plan. I'll explain why the United States decided to launch this operation, talk about the various components of the strategy to achieve success in this very ambitious plan that the United States put together, share a little bit about the hurdles, and then finally, lessons learned as we move forward. So let me begin with what happened and why the United States decided to launch Operation Warp Speed. Of course, you all remember January 2020 happened and Wuhan, China was closed down due to COVID-19. Just 2 months later, the World Health Organization declared the pandemic, and countries and states and localities across the world were starting to close down. In the United States, you all might know that this was a very conflicted moment for our citizenry. Many people didn't believe that they should be mandated to wear masks. They didn't think they should stay home. They wanted to prioritize their own freedom and their own autonomy. And so we were a world leader in the spread of COVID. Not something we wanted to be the world leader in, but we were the world leader in the spread of COVID. And we thought the only way out of it was to discover the vaccine. So we decided later on that year that we would launch Operation Warp Speed, and the goal of this operation was to discover and distribute COVID vaccines in 10 months. I'll talk a little bit about why that was so audacious and even quite radical. But first, let me continue with the timeline. We did achieve the goal, as you all probably know. The first vaccine dose was distributed in January of 2021. And then eventually Warp Speed was wound down exactly a year ago today. So let me share a little bit about why that 10-month goal was thought to be far-fetched and even ludicrous in some groups. The history of vaccine development shows that it takes a long time. It's a slow process. The science behind the discovery and then all of the clinical tests, going to market, getting approvals, takes not just years, but often decades, if not a century. As you can see what I have on my screen right now, there's typhoid fever, meningitis, polio. Throughout history, these vaccines were discovered, but never in history had the discovery and the vaccine come to market in a few years, let alone less than a year. The historical moment that Americans look to was mumps, which was a 4-year process, and that was considered unbelievable and a wild success. So the idea that this would happen in just 10 months seemed literally far-fetched and ludicrous to a lot of people. And the reason for that, as I just said, is the traditional vaccine timeline is a slow process. It's very costly to the companies who are investing this money and doing the research, and there's a high probability of failure. So there's the science and the exploratory phase, and then the preclinical phase. There are 3 clinical trials, each phase of the clinical trials getting bigger and bigger. The only way you can get to the next phase in the clinical trial is if your earlier phases had been successful. And then eventually large-scale manufacturing, and even the manufacturing is overseen by the government to make sure that it is being done correctly before approval will be obtained by the company. So on average, this is a 10-year timeline. And what the United States decided to do was do this in 10 months. Well, how? How is this going to happen? The way it was going to happen was rather than the sequential model, which I just showed you, each and every piece of the problem is solved one piece at a time. The new model for COVID-19 would have overlapping sequences. The science and the preclinical stages would be launched, but then the 3 clinical trials with humans would be overlapping. You wouldn't have to succeed in the first trial before you could start launching the second and third trial. And then the companies didn't have to finish the 3 trials before the federal government in the United States would start reviewing the trials and the results and even giving preliminary review and approval. And then even before the clinical trials were done and approvals obtained, manufacturing would start. So it would be an overlapping process, one that has never happened before in the history of vaccine development in the United States. Well, what happened was we succeeded in this, and a lot of people are looking back and trying to understand why this success happened, and it really boils down to 6 different components of the strategy. There's a lot to this story that we could talk about. I could talk about causality. Was Operation Warp Speed actually necessary? I could talk about the Russia role and the China role, but again, for now, I'm thinking about just the United States. There are 6 components to this innovative strategy, and being the Vice President of Innovation at the RAND Corporation, I think of this strategy as not only one that could be used in the context of the government in the private sector, but in all sectors, inside graduate schools, inside think tanks, inside government organizations. So these 6 points can be extrapolated and really used anywhere. So let me begin. The first way that the group started thinking about this is we needed a unique structure. And with that structure, we needed a clarity of mission. Every single person involved needed to understand what the mission was, and the mission was to find a vaccine as soon as possible. Next, there was a unique partnership. This was a public-private partnership, and everybody agreed that no component of the market could solve this problem by itself. The private sector, the nonprofit sector, the public sector, everyone had to be involved. So this was a unique partnership. Third, the budget. There was a massive amount of money that was devoted to this project up front. Originally, $12 billion was awarded to the companies. Eventually, that spiked up to 18 billion American dollars. And essentially, what the government said is that we'll help all of you companies, and at the same time, and this goes to something Professor Choi was just saying, the government agreed to eliminate the liability costs to the corporations in the case of a failed vaccine. Now, it wouldn't mean that consumers had absolutely no recourse, but the companies wouldn't be in charge of it. That is, the companies wouldn't themselves be paying it. And then there are 3 more components to the strategy that unfolded. Diversification of investment. Everyone agreed that we shouldn't count on just one scientific group, one corporation. Instead, there should be many corporations that were funded. In fact, there were 11 corporations that received portions of this money, and the idea was that with 11 competitors racing to get the vaccine, there would be a greater likelihood that at least one would achieve its goals. And one way to think about this is a plane with multiple engines. A plane can still land safely at its destination from LAX to Seoul, even if one of the engines fails, because the other 3 engines will continue to operate. So one failure wouldn't mean that we couldn't achieve the ultimate goal, diversification of the investment. More than just one group had to try, with the idea that failure would occur, and it's okay if failure happens. Something very different, I understand, than how you all think in Korea. In fact, that's what you were saying, Professor Choi, when you mentioned that it's nerve-wracking if you're in government and you make a mistake and you get punished. Instead, here, failure was expected, but please come and be a part of the team. There was also alignment of interests. All the parties knew that if this could be pulled off, it would be great for everyone. We would solve the problem of the spread of COVID. There would be a lot of corporate profits in the end, and there would be an ambitious scientific advancement never before obscene. So alignment of interests, and then finally, a commitment to transparency. The nation was brought into the conversation, a lot of sharing of information, and public conversations happening all the time. So those 6 components made up the strategy for Operation Warp Speed, and as we know, it worked. In fact, the vaccine was discovered earlier than the 10-month window, and that started rolling out in January of 2021, with millions of doses being distributed. But in order to succeed, people had to agree to take the vaccine, and that's where there was an incredible speed bump to Operation Warp Speed. There were, in fact, 2 hurdles to getting the vaccine to people who would then take the vaccine. So originally, what Operation Warp Speed called for were 300 million doses to hit the market in January of 2021. That didn't happen for several months down the road. And then even when the doses did hit the market, individuals were starting to refuse to accept the doses. Why? Well, first, manufacturing hurdles. We've heard a lot about this. There were difficulties with getting the doses to the market due to limited manufacturing capacity, disruptions in the supply chain. We've talked a lot about that, workforce gaps. Those eventually were overcome, and we managed to get the doses to the market. The bigger problem that America faced was vaccine hesitancy. Some say that the operation couldn't be trusted because the name, Operation Warp Speed, sounded too much like science fiction, not real science. So people were worried that, in fact, this wasn't a trustworthy vaccine. And there was a general mistrust of whether this vaccine was something that could actually eliminate COVID or would create other health problems. There was this perception that we don't need the vaccine, we would eventually achieve herd immunity. Some communities had a hard time getting access to the vaccine. I can say that my community did where I was living. We couldn't just go get it. We had to drive hours and hours, wait in long lines. So some people said, I don't want to do that. I can't do that. I can't get off my job, or can't take time off. And then there were lots of politics, the messaging, anti-vaccination rhetoric that emerged inside the United States, causing this vaccination hesitancy across the entire country. Now, of course, vaccination hesitancy isn't altogether a new problem. We saw it in prior times in the United States, and in fact, it's a global problem that has been emerging over the course of time, and quite a few people have conducted studies on vaccination hesitation. The hesitation often revolves around factors that we've seen over and over that are correlated to this hesitancy, revolving around race, gender, age, religiosity, income levels. So there's a lot of information that we have with regard to why people might not want to take the vaccine. Sadly, we didn't have a plan in the United States to address this problem. We did an extraordinary job, really hit the ball out of the park, as we like to say in America, using that baseball metaphor, when it came to science and technology, but not getting the humans and the citizens to take the vaccine up. My colleagues back at RAND have studied science and technology and how to convince communities to accept science and technology in quite a few different contexts. And here in this schematic, it's something that my RAND colleagues put together. And the point of this schematic is to show you that in the United States, it's a very, very diverse country, with lots of different perspectives, lots of different ethnicities and income levels. And one of the ways to achieve success, in fact, many would say the only way to achieve success, is to recognize that you can't have just one message for your country, at least not the United States. In fact, you have to have multiple messages that are geared towards individual communities sent by a trusted communicator. And that trusted communicator could be a religious leader, a health expert, even a social influencer. It depends on who the person is, but it couldn't be just one message, which was what we were doing in the United States when we were rolling out the vaccine. We were really excited. We discovered it in record time, and then the ball stopped. In fact, in Los Angeles, a lot of my colleagues and students worked together in the city of Los Angeles to encourage individuals in different communities, high income, middle income, and low income communities. We went out to those communities, set up tents, had conversations in order to foster the take-up of this vaccine. So let me just share a few final comments on what the future holds for this area of study. First, Operation Warp Speed made it very clear that these ambitious scientific goals can be undertaken and achieved even if never before in history were these goals achieved. So science and technology can work on a much faster pace than we've ever observed before. At the same time, science and technology only gets you so far. The last tactical mile has to involve the communities, and there has to be a plan to roll the science and technology out in a way that convinces everyone in the community that the science and technology is worthy and should be taken up and should be grasped and viewed as essential to the initiative's success. Second, there's a lot of conversations right now in the United States that revolve around the question, can I have an Operation Warp Speed? All of those individuals who have a fear of cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, where's my Operation Warp Speed? So the big question is this Operation Warp Speed transferable into other contexts, other health contexts? Or is it something that's a once-in-a-century event that would be hard to put together again? As I said, as the Vice President of Innovation at the RAND Corporation, I think those 6 strategy bullet points that I shared, a unique structure with a clear mission, unique partnership of people coming together, having the budget, diversified investment with a recognition of failure, aligned interests, and transparency, can work in any context. And it's something that I think a lot about back home when I think with my vice president hat of innovation, how to foster an environment of innovation inside our organization. And then finally, I think a big lesson that we've all learned is even when there's an amazing advancement of science and technology in a single country, when it comes to a health challenge, that's not enough because health challenges don't have borders. Everybody across the world needs to have access to the solutions that are discovered. And when that doesn't happen, well, there's a humanitarian crisis of a continuation of the spread of COVID, and also the global economy continued to slow down without the sharing of the vaccines. And there was a lot of consternation about that with regard to American corporations who had manufacturing hubs in and around the other parts of the world that didn't have access to the vaccines. And it became very clear that there needed to be a spread of the vaccines to stop the spread of COVID. So let me pause there and thank you again for inviting me to this wonderful conference, and I appreciate the introductory remarks. Thank you.
네, 낸시 스타우트
Thank you very much. That was Vice President Nancy Stout. Yes, and I think that she has saved us some time for some of the panelists. She has spoken about the innovative approach taken by the United States in vaccine development for COVID-19 and how they have made such an enormous triumph, really. However, there was vaccine hesitancy, and one of the key takeaways is that we have to come up with multiple messages given by many different trusted sources of information. She has also talked about this importance of being persuasive, even when there is science and technological breakthroughs. And we have to think about how we spread innovation. And instead of being nationalistic, we have to all work together and engage with other nations.
고요.
So we enjoyed the 2 presentations.
토론은
Now let's have a panel discussion. Here, in the order in the program, I'm going to first invite Dr. Yang, Director of the Center for Regulatory Studies of Korea Development Institute, for his initial discussion. 10 minutes, please.
예, 안녕하세요.
Hello, as has been introduced, I am Yonghyun Yang, Director of the Center for Regulatory Studies at KDI. Thank you for the presentations. I was thinking about 8 minutes and you gave me 10 minutes, so that's good. So I'm going to share with you my thoughts on these presentations and the topic. I'm not sure if I would be able to do a good job, but first about Professor Choi's presentation, how we can improve regulations. a new paradigm for regulatory innovation. It was very impressive. He discussed the differences between danger and risk, and also negative regulation and the other types of regulation, as well as regulatory sandbox. So his presentation covered a lot. And each of these topics could even be a topic of a major conference. So these are all very heavy topics. And in May this year, we have KTI and Korea Institute of Public Administration and Korea Legislation Research Institute. We thought that even the negative regulation itself could be a topic for the whole afternoon of the seminar. So I thought about this topic, and he briefly mentioned the regulation. So when you think about voluntary regulation, you can break it into several categories. As Professor Choi mentioned, in the past, the company representatives would be given authority over the business operation. And also the trade organizations, industry organizations, they would be given some authority, and such trade organizations will regulate the member companies. So that was a form of a voluntary regulation in the past. But now we should move away from the association-focused regulation to an individual company level voluntary regulation. But if that is going to happen, then this means that the company should be capable enough to regulate its own operation. So there's capacity issue. And smaller companies may not have enough capacity to do so, so the government has to provide support. If voluntary regulation is to be successful, then this has something to do with principle-based regulation. So in other words, the government will give a set goal, objectives. And so let's say that there's a goal, and companies can choose methods to achieve that goal. So it's voluntary in that sense. So the government has to set the bar, will set the goal, and each company will try to achieve that goal by implementing a number of measures internally. So the company should be able to understand which methods or which measures are necessary to achieve that goal that's been given by the government. But that requires expertise and capacity. So capacity building, I believe, is a prerequisite. It has to be done first. In this current government, they're talking about voluntary regulations by companies in the private sector, especially when it comes to the online platform companies. The government is trying to introduce some voluntary regulation for platform companies in the online space. Until last year, they were trying to enact the Online Fair Competition Act to determine what transactions can be allowed. So this was an initiative by the government to control the platform companies' businesses with law. But now the new government is trying to go in a different direction. They want to provide support while a voluntary implementation and regulation will be conducted by individual companies. Of course, the oversight structure may vary, but what they're trying to do is to give some criteria, and the platform companies will implement various measures voluntarily together with their consumers and users to regulate their business activities. Of course, recently there was some unfortunate incidents. Some are arguing for more strict regulation rather than voluntary regulation, as Professor Choi mentioned. So there may be discussions on relaxing some regulations, but when a safety accident occurs, then in order to cover up for that, there will even stronger regulations could be introduced. So such a tendency has been observed in the past. And likewise, this time around, once again, there is a strong voice for stronger regulation on the online platform companies. So the government is considering to move away from the initial idea of a voluntary regulation to a more strict regulation. But we really need to fundamentally think about how to reduce risks. And companies they know how best to reduce risks involved in their business operation. And the companies need to continue to study and understand potential risks that their business could give to consumers or citizens, basically. And also at the same time, government officials have to be more knowledgeable about them, but they may not be as knowledgeable as companies because the companies, they know what inherent risks they have in their operation. So I believe that voluntary regulation can be introduced gradually, giving companies a set goal. Let's say there's a list of things that they need to comply with. And then, as for the specific methods or measures to achieve these goals, it is up to the companies. And I think that there are some successful cases, like HSD in the UK. They apply voluntary regulation for safety. But in Korea, I think that such voluntary regulation can first be applied for bigger companies because they have more capabilities. But we also have to be careful that some public may think that we're giving more immunity or autonomy to larger companies only. So that's something that we need to be careful about when it comes to communication. Now, moving on to Nancy's presentation, I thought about the kinds of questions that I would like to ask. And as I was listening to her presentation, it came to my mind. I was able to learn these 6 strategies or 6 components of a successful operation. So I agree that these are very fundamental principles. But then how can we have this type of operation in what context? And at the end of the presentation, Nancy said that in the case of a very urgent crisis, well, not all 6 components may work well, but when we are faced with a major crisis, everyone has a sense of crisis, then this may work. But otherwise, in normal situations, let's say massive government funding is required, or diversification of effort, diversification of investment. I wonder if these can be implemented successfully if we're not in a major crisis situation. Well, let's say we're not in a crisis, then I wonder if we can successfully go ahead with eliminating the liability aspect and utilizing multiple investments and trying different methods at the same time. I wonder if such a mechanism can be effective and can function in a situation that is not a major crisis. Of course, the pandemic is such a major health crisis, so everyone was on board and they all knew that they had to do it. But I wonder if this could work in other normal situations. And so that's my only question. I wonder if Nancy can address that later on. Another major crisis is climate change. And this is not a short-term crisis. And short-term, we don't have short-term solutions to climate change. But still, we can think about an effective message, multiple messages that we can utilize to talk to people in different communities and different backgrounds. And we can apply what Nancy proposed, or Operation Speed Warp, to a climate crisis situation. Thank you.
양용현
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Yang talked about how there needs to be a more capacity from the parts of companies and big role of the government. And also the other question was whether Operation Warp Speed or something like that can be done in a lower crisis level situation. Thank you for that. And now we'd like to turn to Jong-han Lee, Director at the Korea Institute of Public Administration. 10 minutes, please.
네, 안녕하십니까. 행정연구원 규제정책연구실.
Hello, my name is Jong-han Lee. I'm a director at the Division of Regulatory Innovation Research at KIPA. So I enjoyed listening to the 2 presentations. And the 2 presentations, I think they are slightly different from one another. But I want to try to merge them as best that I can. They're both talking about government policy and receptivity to those policies. And so I think that we can approach both the presentations from that thematic approach. I feel that it is important for us to talk about different strategies and how we can innovate different regulations. So in a normal situation, if we were to innovate regulation, then we would take individual pieces of regulation, look at them, and try to innovate them as we can. So that would take up about maybe 70 or 80% of our work, and then about 20 to 30% of our work would be devoted to a more fundamental innovation to regulation. And I think this has been the practice in the past, but I think now we are seeing a little bit of a pivot, that there's more devotion paid to fundamental innovative efforts, maybe about 50%, in fact. I think that is well warranted. That 50% of our efforts should be geared more towards doing fundamental innovation. And in fact, I think that is why we're here discussing a new paradigm for regulatory innovation. And to create a new paradigm, what exactly should we do? And this is the thrust of my discussion points today. The first is that regulation should be seen as a kind of social rule. In Professor Choi's presentation, he did emphasize this point. There are many different means that can be used to, I guess, adjust and manage individual decision making. And when there are these autonomous means, so maybe, for example, in society, we can consider certain customs or norms. I do believe that these customs and norms would be functioning in a regular, normal society. So even before we talk about laws or regulations, perhaps these customs and norms would have already kicked in society. Maybe culture, norms, and mores, custom. These would go a long way to consistently shape individuals' decision making. Which is why, of course, this would vary by society, but this autonomous kind of rules, whether or not these autonomous rules are functioning well and properly, depending on that level, the amount of regulation or the implementation of different regulations would be also different depending on the jurisdiction. And then, other than these autonomous social rules like mores and customs, then there would be legal recourse, so some more enforceable legal means. But even when we discuss legal means, I think we can break them down into two parts. So there's the, as Professor Choi said, there is the ex post legal relief measures from the point of view of personal responsibility, and when this culpability is not functioning well, then we would go the route of regulation. This means then we have to consider how this issue of personal responsibility or personal culpability is really functioning very well in our society. And depending on that, then this would go back to how much regulation we should try to set and enforce. So then, if we think about regulation, innovation, there are those different layers. So there's the social customs and mores that are autonomously kind of considered by different individuals. And then if not, then there's that level of individual responsibility. And if that fails, then we can fall back on regulation, and etc. But many economists often talk about the tragedy of the commons. And in a situation where there's a tragedy of the commons, if we were to thrust some pre-legislation or some kind of regulation to the people and foist it on them ahead of time, that would obviously not pass. So there needs to be some kind of consensus with the public and determine a kind of pledge or determine a kind of promise with the society so that we make sure that the rules and the regulations we set would not lead to a tragedy of the commons situation. But if this is not kept well, then we can apply the personal culpability rule. And if that also fails, then we can set a fence around or engage in some other kind of countermeasure. And that would be similar to the regulation that we're talking about today. Oh, again, so there's this idea of the social autonomous rules and personal culpability. Of course, I want to make the point clear that these are, I guess, not things that are non-complementary. They are complementary to one another. They can coexist together. However, the trends or the slight currents might be different. So in some societies where the social mores and customs are very strongly enforced, then regulations might not be as much needed. But in a society where that is not necessarily the case, there might be some added need for regulation. So we have to ask ourselves, where are we as a society right now? And then I want to talk about principle-based regulation and rule-based regulation. As Professor Choi said, I think that I guess a principle-based regulation will be the direct translation of this, but I think that the translation you use was a little bit different. You said it's principle-based supervision. So I've thought of this, and I can agree why the translation was principle-based supervision and not regulation. I actually maybe am inclined to agree with supervision, but because I think the meaning is closer to supervision. Because this rule-based regulation and principle-based regulation, it's really about those areas where we have to really keep in line, and that is more along rule-based regulation. But if they are not in line with rule-based regulation, then it should be principle-based regulation. I think that we can debate about how we're going to, categorize the regulation under these two. But I think that I don't think we can solve this issue by just saying that we're going to use a different expression, or we're just going to use different words. The important issue is when there's regulation that is made, and if there is regulation compliance, and if not, then this could lead to possible sanctions. This whole process of regulatory implementation, if we were to consider that, then the principle-based regulation should be facilitated in a system. So there needs to be a kind of framework that enables this entire system of principle-based regulation to be properly implemented. So for that, we would also have to consider compliance strategies, for example. So we would have to ask ourselves how we're going to come up with such compliance strategies. And on test-based regulation, I would like to talk a little bit more at length on this, but I don't think I don't have a lot of time now, so I want to just touch upon the issue of governance on rule-based or principle-based, that I think basically this test-based kind of regulation, such as regulatory sandbox, this all comes down to the issue of governance. Because when there are more interested stakeholders and institutions and different participants who come in and there's no trust among them, then whether it be principle-based regulation or regulatory sandboxes or whatnot, these would not be successfully implemented. So again, it comes down to the issue of trust and governance. And that is what we would have to take into consideration. With that, I would like to conclude my remarks.
네, 이종환 실장님.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. he talked about autonomous or voluntary regulation and rule-based regulation and principle-based regulation, as well as civil liability. So in order to be more of a principle-based regulation, we need more compliance, and this also requires good governance structure in place. Next, I'm going to invite Director Young-hyuk Cho of the Regulatory Legislation Research Center at the Korea Legislation Research Institute. Hello. As has been introduced, I am Yong-hyuk Cho at the Korea Legislation Research Institute. Thank you for these two presentations. I learned a lot, and I also enjoyed the panel discussions by the two previous panel members. I was able to understand all these discussions on a new paradigm for regulatory innovation and enhancement. And in my discussion, I would like to discuss my perspective as a legal researcher on regulation. In the study of law, I believe that we were trying to interpret regulations. When you study law, the first book that you would read is the Introduction to the Legal Study. And in the initial chapters, you talk about ethics and morals that you need to safeguard. This is basically order, and you try to interpret regulations. So in the study of law, we didn't really try to dissect regulations, but I believe this is what we now need to do. We need to expand the scope of regulation studies. So in the study of law, I believe that we need to be more active in conducting research on regulations and what they really mean. I'm not saying that all regulations are bad, because the term regulation itself sometimes has negative connotation, and people seem to perceive regulations as bad. But I would say a regulation is bad when it is not relevant any longer. It may have been relevant in the past, but not any longer because the context has changed. And sometimes there is a not well-designed regulation because it did not include some of the important aspects that had to be taken into account. In some cases, regulations were not thought out as carefully as they should. So in these areas, we need to improve them, of course. A good example of a bad regulation was the red flag regulation. At that time, we had horse carriages and trains and cars all together on the roads. And there was a problem of this very loud honk of a train that would startle the horse, which may lead to an accident. So such a regulation was needed back then in the past, but not any longer. So regulations will have to evolve as our context and situations and circumstances change. So likewise, it is critical to have a timely regulation that is relevant. And Professor Choi mentioned about risks and dangers. And in the study of law, this, I believe, has to do with whether such a regulation may violate freedom and the fundamental rights of humans, or the obligation of protecting them from imminent danger and risks. So when you devise a regulation or strengthen a regulation, or when you review the existing regulation, I believe that we need to put in place a framework to review the existing regulations constantly on a regular basis. There may be some changes to our technology, industries, and environment, and accordingly, our regulations have to be updated. And secondly, I'd like to talk about the regulatory sandbox programs in Korea. We introduced the regulatory sandbox a little later than other countries, but in Korea, we have extensive regulatory sandboxes, and the achievements were great. For the past 3 years, we have had a lot of achievements and more than 600 cases that are subject to regulatory sandbox. But the goal of the regulatory sandbox should not be giving out special permits. the objective of a regulatory sandbox has to be identifying some of the unnecessary regulation and revising them or reforming them. But what is happening right now is that we have the regulatory sandboxes, but regulations stay. They don't get updated or changed. And those who get special treatment in the regulatory sandbox would enter the market first. So they will win compared to the other companies, but we still have the existing regulations unchanged. So it is unfortunate that the current implementation of the regulatory sandbox is actually against the actual goal of the regulatory sandbox. So I believe that we need to demand more regulatory changes and reforms. I believe we need to make a distinction between temporary permit and a temporary permit is given out to companies when the regulation is not appropriate. So when a temporary permit is granted, I believe that the government has to work hard to revise the legal system so that the company that receives the permanent permit can be granted the regular permit after the revision of the laws and regulations. But otherwise, if the legal revision is not done yet, then the temporary permit will have to be extended. So I believe that such temporary permit should not be used as a special treatment to any single company. There should be fairness. But when it comes to demonstration permit, a demonstration permit is given out to a company that wants to test the safety of an innovation. The demonstration permit is given out to a case where safety is not proven yet. So we need to see the outcome of the demonstration to see if such an innovation is safe or not, and then we can start discussing how to revise the law. So we need to make a distinction between a temporary permit and the demonstration permit. I would also like to talk about the voluntary regulation approach. I got a text message in the morning, and in that text message there was a URL link, and I thought it was a phishing message. I thought so it was phishing, so I deleted that message. But it was actually a proper message from one of the clients of my institutes. But I deleted that because I've learned a lesson from and I learned that this type of message would be risky, and if I click on that link, then my phone could be hacked. So I had this lesson. Likewise, so it means that I recognize the cost, the potential cost and risk of clicking onto this link. Likewise, companies have to continue to be educated, especially when it comes to cyber risks. When there is no cyber attack, then companies will view them as costs. But companies have to view them as investments so that they could prevent potential damage and losses that could arise out of a cyber attack. Likewise, when we communicate the message to the private sector that a voluntary regulation will help you reduce compliance costs by implementing internal control and measures to prevent such risks. Thank you.
네, 조용혁 센터.
Yes, thank you very much. It's talked about how we would need to I guess, break apart regulation from the point of view of legal studies, and we have to be very proactive, make sure that they are not behind the times, that regulatory sandbox is not really something that we should see from the point of view of regulation, and that voluntary regulation should be seen as investment and not necessarily as cost. We've heard from the three panelists now. If there are any questions from the floor, I think we have enough time for maybe one question.
네, 없으시면
If there are no questions, I'm going to turn to our presenters for their feedback, maybe about 2 minutes each, I think. So we'll begin with Professor Choi and then turn to Ms. Stout.
네,
Thank you. I appreciate all the comments. Director Yang, Director Lee, and Director Cho, thank you for your comments. So valuable and so insightful that I don't really have anything else to add, or because all these comments are so important, especially Director Yang. He talked about voluntary regulation, whether companies are capable of putting in place their internal measures and what should be the role of the government. These comments were really valuable, and so I will take them into consideration. And Director Lee mentioned that civil society voluntary regulation is actually a representative of how advanced your society is, and ex post regulation has to be done in an effective manner. Yes, I agree. When we take a look at our own legal system, the problem is that if it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, it takes 3 years. But I don't know if you have gone through this litigation process or a lawsuit, but however small the legal case is for the plaintiff, it is a painful process. It takes more than 3 years. So as Mr. Lee mentioned, when it comes to ex post regulation, I believe that we need to put in place an effective and speedy relief measures and remedies in place, and we need to have a better dispute resolution mechanism. And there may be areas where interpretations may not be clear. Then for these areas, if we add more clarity, then we can reduce time and cost and effort in the legal process. So in that sense, we have this legal interpretation committee, and this committee has to be more specialized in doing so to reduce any issue of clarity. And also there is an issue of cooperation, but in the study of law, we think about participation and guarantee. So these are the kinds of ideas that we need to continue to promote. And Director Cho, he is also a student of law, so he offered some legal aspects of the regulations and made some important comments. And he mentioned that the ultimate goal of, or the effectiveness of the regulatory sandbox has to do with how fast and how quickly the National Assembly, the Parliament, can go through regulatory revision and the legal revision. The administrative branch is quick, but the National Assembly, the lawmaking body, may slow down the process. So even if safety is proven from the demonstration permit, sometimes laws are not properly revised quickly, so that this would delay the process of introducing innovation. And finally, what I like to mention is that when it comes to regulation, I hope to be able to gather some data on the history of regulation. Let's say the life cycle of a regulation. Let's say how a regulation is born and how in the middle this regulation is transformed or changed. And because of a safety accident, there may be some back step, and then later we may make some forward steps. So in some of the key areas, it will be very interesting to gather data on the entire life cycle and the history of regulations, the key regulations. And in doing so, in making such a research, I believe we can learn a lot of important lessons. So it's my personal research agenda. Thank you.
Thank you for these amazing comments and for your question. I appreciate that. I know all countries and societies tend to think about regulation in different ways. Some countries lean into regulation and have a thick set of regulations and oversight, and other countries favor a more free market, a thin set of regulations. But there often, if there's a judicial, as you were saying, Professor Choi, if there's a judicial structure, even the threat of litigation and the threat of being held liable in court without regulation can foster self-regulation. But there's also regulation to cabin behavior for safety, for fairness, to organize society. And then a third approach, which is regulation to incentivize, which is what I was talking about. How to set up a structure of regulations that incentivize behavior to ensure the society, whether it's corporate or individuals, act in a way to advance goals that the society has. And what you asked, Mr. Yang, is whether Operation Warp Speed could happen outside the context of once-in-a-century crisis or maybe wartime, and that's the question that everybody's asking. I think the answer is yes. The reason for this is because Operation Warp Speed didn't change all of American focus. The vast majority of corporations and individuals and nonprofits and government actors were doing what they always do. Just 11 corporations were involved in Operation Warp Speed, and $18 billion is a lot of money, but it's not the entire amount of the budget. So, there was a small group of corporations and a certain amount of money devoted to this, the recognition that failure could happen, and then, we proceeded as I outlined. So my hope is that this isn't something that is unique to a once-in-a-century crisis or a wartime activity. A lot of people compare Operation Warp Speed to what happens during warp time when the country comes together, has a common goal, no one cares about costs, and people analogize Operation Warp Speed. Let me just say real quickly, being close to Silicon Valley and being in the RAND Corporation, this concept of putting together a goal, funding that goal, promising everyone that's involved in that goal that some of you will fail, but don't worry, you'll still be a part of the team, is very common. So as Vice President of Innovation, I often take strategies similar to what I outlined inside my enterprise, and you see it all the time in Silicon Valley. In fact, we have an alumnus who comes back to RAND who heads up innovation inside Netflix, and he describes exactly this approach. So I would say yes, this can be used in all sorts of different contexts, whether it's in the government context or private context. Thank you again for inviting me to speak.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. So we heard the final remarks from the presenters. And the theme of this session is New Paradigm for Regulatory Innovation. And through the two presentations and panel discussions, I believe that we were able to cover a large area. And going forward, the three research institutes will continue to conduct the research and conclude our findings. And there's an MOU among these three research institutes. So we're going to carry out joint research, and we're going to disseminate the findings, the results of our joint research, so that we can make contributions, substantial contributions to enhancing the regulations in the Korean society. With that, let's wrap up the session. Thank you very much.
네, 규제 혁신의
Thank you very much. This was session number 3 on the new paradigm for regulatory innovation. Regulations mean that we have a set of rules that we need to abide by, and some people seem to consider regulation as a negative thing that prevents us from doing things. But as we heard from the presenters and the panel members, we need regulations, but at the same time, we sometimes need to implement something similar to warp speed operation to carry out innovation as quickly as possible. So this was a very informative session. I hope you all enjoyed the session. With that, we would like to conclude session number 3 by giving a big round of applause to the moderator as well as the presenters and panel members. Thank you very much. So this is the end of session number 3, and we will have a short break. And starting from 3:45, session number 5 will begin in this room. So enjoy your break and hope to see you again back here for session 5. Thank you.
네, 안녕하십니까. 경제
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Reboot Korea 2022, hosted by KDI and NRC. My name is Kang Ji-hye. I'll be your MC. Thank you very much. This is our fifth session. And as the sessions progress, I believe that we are engaging in a more in-depth discussion. And I believe that in this session, we will also have a meaningful time. This session is being held under the theme of social cohesion and future social safety. Under COVID-19, the keyword safety has become very important for us, and also with the Russia-Ukraine war and US-China conflict, we've been seeing various social challenges leading to many societal and generational conflict as well. Under Reboot Korea 2022, we are thinking of taking a new leap forward, and I believe safety is going to be key in the future. Hopefully, we will be able to hear much from our panelists on this issue of social safety. We have many experts who will be talking about social safety and social cohesion, public welfare, public health, safety measures, where many members of the public can take social ownership and feel a sense of community in the framework of social safety. I would like to introduce our chair moderator as well as the presenters and the panelists. First of all, a moderator from the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs, Tae-soo Lee, is our moderator. We have three presenters with us today. a Senior Research Fellow at the Department of Poverty and Inequality Research at the Korean Institute for Health and Social Affairs, Tae-won Kim. And also from Korea Institute of Public Administration, Hyun-suk Ryu, Senior Research Fellow for Disaster Safety and Social Integration Research. And our third presenter will be joining us on Zoom from University of Turku, Finland, Professor Anne Alvasalo-Kusi. And we also have three panelists with us today. Professor Tae Kyun-yu of the Department of Social Welfare at Seoul University. Then we have Jae Hyun-bae, legislative researcher at the Public Administration and Safety Team at the National Assembly Research Service. And then we have from the Korean Institute of Criminology and Justice, Chung-suk Yoon, Senior Research Fellow, Crime Analysis and Survey Research Division. We have just introduced the moderator and the presenters and panelists to you. Now we will kick off the fifth session. I'd like to hand over the microphone to our moderator.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. So, as had been introduced, I am Tae-soo Lee, President at the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs. As you may know very well, in this session, we have put together the session together with the KDI and the Korea Institute and other research institutes, NRC, but this particular session has been put together by the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs, as well as the Korea Institute of Public Administration and the Korea Institute of Criminology and Justice. So we have with us in the session three representatives from the three research institutes, and we also have experts from outside institutions, especially because this is an international seminar. We have with us Professor Anne Alvasalo-Kusi from Finland. So this is how the session is composed of. We are going to be discussing matters related to social cohesion and social safety. Some of you may think that social cohesion and social safety are not very related, but in order to promote social cohesion, we need to guarantee safety of our citizens. We need to make sure that our citizens feel secure and safe. And based on social cohesion, we can address many social challenges together, especially to eliminate any sources of anxiety and fear. Therefore, having said that, you can see the connection between social cohesion and social safety, and dealing with these two very interlinked topics is meaningful. We're going to invite three presentations, which will be followed by panel discussions of the three panelists. And if you have any questions among these offline audience as well as online audience, we would love to entertain questions from the audience as well. Because we have three presentations, I will give each presenter 15 minutes so that we can have time for the panel discussion and the Q&As. For each panel member, I would like to give 8 to 10 minutes each. This is how we are going to conduct the session. So, Professor Anne, I'm not sure what time it is in Finland, exactly what time it is. I hope it's not too inconvenient for you. Oh, it's 7 o'clock. Okay. So it's early in the morning, I guess. So thank you so much for joining us. And later, I will give you 15 minutes, just like the other presenters. Now, first, I'd like to invite Senior Research Fellow, Mr. Kim, from the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs, and he's the head of the Department of Poverty and Inequality Research, and he is a well-renowned researcher on the topic of poverty and inequality. So please go ahead. Thank you, Dr. Kim.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Hello, my name is Taewon Kim of the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this very important conference. We are here under Reboot Korea, so we are trying to reboot Korea, so to speak, try to take a new leap forward. And that is why I am here to discuss conflict in South Korean society, and conflict is something that we would have to definitely uproot if we were to reboot Korea. And today, I would also like to maybe discuss some policies, but more than that, I want to talk about the state of conflict in South Korean society today. So I would like to take stock of the situation. And listening to the other presentations, for example, in the next room, there were presentations on the Germany's case and Japan's case. And I think that the Japanese speaker, a lot of the different social conflict that was present in Japanese society are very similar to the conflict that we are seeing it in Korea today. I thought that was very interesting. I'm going to talk about these three aspects. As you know, in Korea, it was a very poor country in the past, but it has developed very rapidly with about $30,000 per capita. And in fact, we are one of the world's 5th largest exporting country. And in fact, many in Korea think that we have become an advanced country. Many people consider that Korea has developed very markedly over the years. And another is that we have become world's 10th largest economies in 2020, and as of July 2021, the UN UNCTAD said that Korea is now an advanced country. Oh, I understand that this was the first time this has happened in 57 years, so this really allowed for a huge surge of pride in Korea. And at the end of 2019 and early from 2020, as you all know, we've suffered from COVID-19, and the media has reported that Korea was relatively successful in responding to COVID-19. These are some of the positive developments that we've seen. And also another positive development is something that you are all aware of, BTS and Korean movies doing well internationally. And these cultural achievements as well, where we are able to now tell more people, export some of our culture to the rest of the world. We're able to see that as the country continues to develop, we wondered whether the people living inside the country are actually happy. I understand in Japan, as you know, it's a very rich, very advanced nation, but many people wonder whether the Japanese people themselves are happy. And so in Korea, there was the same concern that maybe the people themselves are not necessarily so happy. As you know, Japan and Korea both have serious low birth rates and severe population aging. They're not getting better, they're only getting worse. And in fact, aging is getting worse compared to other countries. And we have conducted research in Korea, but also in the Japanese speaker's presentation, we're able to see that if we compare with Germany's case and Japan's case, they've had low birth rate issues as well. And in trying to solve this, one of the first things that they did was to try to have harmony and balance inside the family. So gender parity and gender equality was some of the things that was emphasized. And this was something that the Japanese speaker mentioned. Low birth rates, population aging basically can be solved with more children, and this disparity between the genders would be something that we would have to address to get rid of certain conflicts in Korea. So for example, in Korea, not many people are getting married, first of all, and even if they are married, they are not having children because the parenting burden, costs of childcare are so expensive, and child rearing is made to be a burden on the women. So as you can see here, the costs are many multiple times that of a GDP per capita compared to other countries. Now, this is definitely an issue that we would have to address if we want to solve the low birth rates issue. I'm sorry, but maybe you can remove your face mask. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, another is that in Korea, industrial accidents, this is also something that is very embarrassing. For Korea, many people, many workers are dying or suffering accidents while working. And this is a very embarrassing statistic. And another thing is that the poverty rate of old age, this is senior poverty, is very high. In fact, compared to other OECD countries, it is quite high. Though it was 43% before, I think it has lowered to about 30% now, but it's still relatively much higher compared to OECD average. So we can see that these are some of these uncomfortable statistics, and they are leading to lower levels of social cohesion. Just briefly on the major conflicts in Korean society. We've always been interested in happiness and quality of life. So they have gone up, but recently, the most recent years, we've seen that they have gone down. We believe that it was because of COVID-19 and also some levels of social isolation. But even with other countries, if we were to compare to other countries, our levels of happiness and quality of life had gone down for the past few years. So it's a big concern for us on how we have to address this. And another thing is that levels of trust in society, we thought that it would have also have gone down over the years, but on the contrary, trust levels have gone up. I think because also during COVID-19, the government took active measures for social health and public health and provided a lot of support for many members of the population, and this has increased levels of social trust. So this is one of those a few things that have gone up. So while happiness and quality of life may have dipped slightly over the past few years, trust levels have gone up. However, when there are some issues with isolation and lack of communication, we've been able to see that when we ask people who is completely trustworthy around you, when you're in a crisis situation, who can you turn to talk? And the people who are around us that we find to be completely trustworthy are decreasing in number. So this is another uncomfortable situation. Over the past few months, we've seen reports in the media that families would commit suicide to get rid of to get out of debt or to get out of poverty. This is because when they're in a crisis situation, there is no one who can help them. And they seem to have gone ignored by society, and the state did not step up to help them. And so in this kind of situation, happiness and quality of life levels will continue to go down. A few years ago, NRC and we continue to worked on a study on conflict. So if we take a look at this, there's different kinds of conflicts, so political conflicts and conflict between managers and workers and etc. And this was true several years ago, but even this year, this is continuing to be the case. So another big conflict is conflict between regular and non-regular workers. So with the number of escalating industrial accidents, this also means that there's a lot of conflict between full-time workers and permanent workers, temporary workers. And the media also has reported, particularly because this spring we've had the presidential election, so there's a lot of generational conflict. So many people are saying that millennials these days, they can work to the bone, but their future is not going to be as better than their parents' generation was. So this is leading to generational conflict in Korea. And I believe that next year, another big change is going to be pension reform in Korea. There's going to be a lot of discussions on that, and these discussions on pension reform are being very challenging because of generational conflict. As time goes on, generational conflict, we hope that it would go down, but in fact, it has not gone down. It has remained relatively constant, that there continues to be this conflict between the generations. And personally, I have to say that there's a lot of different conflicts, but something that has been more marked over the past few months is political conflict. I think it's because we've had the presidential election this spring, but there's the conflict between progressives and conservatives, and also between different regions and ruling party and opposition party. This is not just being kept at the actual political arena, but in fact, this is pushing out into the wider society as a whole. And if we look at a U.S. study, this is a U.S. study that said that the United States is top in the world in terms of political conflict, but Korea is right up there with the U.S. So this means that many high-level ranking politicians should also consider this to be a very serious issue that we have to address. And then there is the issue of fairness. This is what the past administration has been focusing on, but many people have a very negative aspect of fairness in terms of employment. Many people say that there is no ladder going up. In the past, if you studied hard, you had a good job, you can go up. And not just you, but your family, your children can have a stable home, stable earnings. But these days, people have very negative outlook on fairness. And they wonder because the country, I mean, Korea as a whole seems to be doing so well, it's developing so rapidly, and yet the people living in Korea, there are not these sufficient safeguards to have them live equitable, fair lives. And even if we try to do our best, there are these blind spots or some regulations, and these are being hurdles in our development and growth. But at least during the COVID-19 crisis, the government really engaged in a lot of stimulus measures. And so you see here, the green is where the green is it stands for disposable income distribution. And we can see that for employment income and business income, they have continued to remain constant over the years. That even before government's intervention, before secondary distribution, the primary distribution, that is, which is being done by the market, is where we're seeing a lot of the impact. Because if we look at the different studies, we've seen that there's this huge gap between full-time and temporary workers, or between genders, or across different regions. These gaps are making primary distribution very difficult. So this is some area where we have to really focus on. Recently in Korea, the public has paid a lot of attention on the wealth gap. And this is taken from National Assembly figures and also from the National Statistical Office, that the Gini coefficient has improved somewhat, looking at income levels, but the wealth gap is growing. So property values, real estate holdings, this is growing. And also it's growing generationally. So this wealth gap is also huge between the older generation, the younger generation. And even inside the same generation, there's huge wealth gap inside the same generation. So this is another huge point of conflict. And many people say that there's this wealth gap because there is a conflict in this labor markets, and there is a social structure that is really tailored towards the rich and professional workforce. And so we thought that it is really the realm of policy to try to address these issues, because this is what the public is concerned about. And so we tried to really understand what the people's concerns were. And we asked people, as I mentioned before, the senior level of insecurity and poverty are quite high. So one of the foremost people's concerns was instability in the old years after retirement. And then the second was employment. And then the third was unemployment. So if you become unemployed, will the government help me? So these were some of the concerns. And in some cases, people worry that some people would be helped out by the government, but some people will not. And so this is a big challenge. And another thing, as you can see here in the middle, is housing costs, because real estate prices have inflated. And so in this year, inflation levels have also gone up. So low-income households have a lot of debt. For these people, they're constantly at risk. So housing costs are also a big concern for many people. And then when we ask people what are social concerns that you have, so these are not personal concerns, but concerns about the country, is that going forward, most people have the biggest concern was the lack of jobs, and then the second is real estate. I think that because the current situation is that many people are concerned about property values, that this is appearing in the statistics. Some people are also worried about infectious disease. I think that Many experts would say that climate change is a very important issue, but as you can see here, it's kind of low on the list. Experts say that climate change and natural disasters are those issues that should be on the top of the list. But if we take a look at this opinion poll, it's not the case. However, it is still on the list down on the bottom, so this is another area that we have to pay attention to. We also asked people where you want the country to be headed in the future. We can see here that the level of public spending is quite low compared to the OECD average. If the OECD average is about 20, we're at about 12. This means that in the future, if we see a lot of expenditure increase, typically with the pension spending, this is going to go up. But if the public spending goes up, that might make a big change. But the actual income levels are continuing to remain low. So it's not going to be enough to cut down on the 40% poverty rate for seniors. And also, the public expenditure, many people consider the actual spending is being done in kind and not in cash. Some people are very critical about this, but in fact, this public spending has been done in kind. And before the government intervenes, as I mentioned before, there is a primary distribution instead of redistribution. And if we look at distribution levels, that they have gone up, and if the income levels also have gone up, this means that we are living in a country where there's very low burden. It's a low burden country, so we have to transition to at least a middle burden country with higher levels of public spending, so that that can go a long way to cut down on the social conflicts that I mentioned before. If we look at all of this, I think that there are two things that we have to work on, really. One is gender inequality, and second, political conflict. I think these are the two key things that we have to work on to try to up the levels of happiness across Korea. Thank you for your attention.
고맙습니다. 한국
Yes, thank you very much. That was a diagnosis, if you will, on the social conflicts in our society today in Korea. In a very short period of time, he gave us an illustration of the social conflicts in Korea. Of course, it's not going to be easy to diagnose all the conflict in full, but he has done a great job. I believe that the Korean Institute for Health and Social Affairs and other relevant think tanks have engaged in a rigorous research on looking into the different aspects of conflicts, and also looking at how the lives of the actual people living in Korea might not necessarily be so happy. And he has tried to present this argument backed up with research. Obviously, there are many people who are not comfortable with the situation right now, and many people believe that the future will not be so bright either. And so this is the findings of some of the public opinion polls that he has provided to us in his presentation. And the key is to try to increase public spending, and we would have to, and that is going to be one of the solutions for us. Now we'll move on to the second presentation.
박사님.
I would like to invite Dr. Yoo Hyun-suk, a senior research fellow at the Korea Institute of Public Administration. She's going to be discussing the implications of COVID-19 in terms of governance. So please go ahead. About 2 weeks ago, I got convicted with COVID, so I cannot spread you the virus, so I'm going to take off my mask. And the topic of my presentation is that, as Dr. Kim mentioned, that the number 3 sources of anxiety for people is infectious diseases. And I'm going to be talking about the infectious disease governance structure. In the previous session, Vice President of RAND, Nancy Stout, gave a presentation, and she discussed the regulatory innovation and how they responded to COVID-19 in the US. So you can connect my presentation to her presentation. You can see how in Korea we have been developing our health emergency governance structure. and what we need to do to improve our governance structure. Well, this time of the day, it's not easy as a presenter because it's not easy to get your constant attention. So I would like to get your attention for maximum 5 minutes because I want to go directly to the lessons learned and the findings of the research. First of all, we're living in the era of uncertainties, and what is certain is that there will be another pandemic. There will be another outbreak of an infectious disease. The disease X, the cycle has been shortened. In the past, it was 10 years, every 10 years, but after MERS, every 3 years, and now it could be every 1 or 2 years. So the next COVID-19, we need to be prepared. We need to work now to prepare for the next pandemic. And the second key takeaway is that after MERS, we actually have learned a lot of lessons. We learned about the negative impact of misinformation and fake news, and how we need to strengthen coordination among the relevant government agencies. And at that time, it was mainly concerned with the Ministry of Health and Welfare and the legal revisions and the Center for Disease Control. At that time, we didn't know that something as big as this one, the COVID-19, would occur. So at that time, we thought that the Ministry of Health and the Center for Disease Control would be able to deal with infectious diseases. And at the time, we had to look at the aspects, the legal aspects. And this time around, Minister of Health, Prime Minister, and the Minister of Interior served as co-leaders of the emergency response committee or headquarters. So we need such a pan-government governance structure in place to respond to health emergencies of this magnitude. And we need multi-layered governance. Within the central government, we have the several organizations and consultative bodies in response to emergencies. So we need more coordination among these consultative bodies and committees, but also we need more coordination between the central and the local governments. We need more coordination between government agencies and Medicare or health institutions, and also coordination between the civil society and the government, so that we can have pan-government as well as pan-society responses. Also, we need to have the governance paradigm shift to put more focus on the role of the regional and local stakeholders and actors. It's been more than 3 years since the outbreak of the COVID-19, so we are still going through COVID-19, but there may be multiple disasters, including in Korea, massive wildfires and also very tragic event in Itaewon. So while we're going through the COVID-19 pandemic, we have multiple emergency situations, and what should be given priorities when there are multiple emergency situations, and how should we allocate resources? And also there's a politics of disaster and emergency, as Nancy mentioned. Sometimes politicians utilize emergencies and natural disasters and pandemics as to advance their political agenda. And the media sometimes facilitate that. So once again, we need to be reminded of the importance of disaster communication. So these are the key takeaways, and you can do something else because I'm pretty much done with delivering the key messages. So back to my presentation. Initially, there was a K-quarantine hype, but disease prevention is not everything. There is another pillar, medical response. But initially, we focused too much on disaster prevention. Let's take a look at the strategies. Different strategies were adopted by different countries. In the case of Sweden, the US, and UK, and in Japan, they focused on herd immunization. So they kind of accepted this risk of COVID-19. And in the case of Taiwan and China, they completely shut down their borders. They wanted to get rid of all the risk factors. But as for Korea, initially, in the first half of 2020, we we made a lot of effort to reduce the number of deaths, and this was quite effective. And then there's another strategy of transferring responsibility to a third party, but because this is global pandemic, you cannot transfer this risk to a third party through reinsurance or insurance. So the goal of the research is that actually after MERS, we talked about risk manuals, risk response manuals, and risk communications. We've tried to improve all the systems, but there was lack of governance, lack of coordination, and these have been pointed out and reported in the media extensively. So I wanted to focus on multi-layered governance system and what the problems are. And I would also like to examine the public's confidence in the current governance structure. And there was the issue of hesitance, vaccination, and so the public acceptance public acceptance about vaccination was another part of the research. Well, we have the administrative organizations and the healthcare organizations, the Ministry of Health and Welfare. There are many people who have the medical doctor degree, but when it comes to the Ministry of Interior and the Prime Minister's office, they are just general policymakers, not specialized in the medical sector or the healthcare area. So it is not easy to coordinate between these different agencies with different kinds of expertise. As I mentioned, we wanted to take a look at the current emergency response governance, and we also used triangulation for our method. So we did both qualitative and quantitative study. As you can see here, because I wanted to learn more, I took a look at the concepts of public health system and the definitions of public health risk, because we don't have a legal definition of what public health risk really is. And I didn't really know much about the governance. So together with Dr. Yoon from the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs, we conducted a co-study. And we took a look at the concepts of public health and public health risk governance, and also we examined the factors for vaccine acceptance. So after doing the theoretical review, we developed a multiple or multi-layered governance and collaboration and cooperation. So we took a look at the level of such coordination. We conducted a survey, and then we also conducted focus group interviews with experts as well as AHP analysis. And then the future risk governance structure for health emergency was devised. And we made recommendations as to what policies are needed in the short term as well as in the midterm. Well, due to time limit, I'm going to skip some of the slides. This is the risk governance system in Korea. So depending on the risk level, you can see which entities are in charge. But here, many experts point out, and especially healthcare professionals say, that the risk assessment level and the risk assessment committee information is not really readily available. So I asked for data. So the severe level, risk alert level red, has been in place for more than 2 years. So this means that the risk level or risk categorization is not appropriate. So it's such a risk adjustment or risk determination has to be made in consideration of not just healthcare risks, but also social and economic risks. And also, we need to think about multiple disasters that are ongoing at the same time, how we're going to respond to them. And there are many variants of COVID-19. But the current risk alert system and the current healthcare risk governance system is not really able to incorporate such different variants. And also, the criteria for public health risk governance assessment may not be appropriate. We have a Professor Moon, so there's agility issue and resilience. When you look at OECD and World Bank, they have the good governance framework, and Professor Moon proposed the ideal digital governance for the future. So I included all of these attributes of the criteria for risk governance. So we not only need to respond to risks, but also we need to learn. And we also need evidence-based decision making. And when it comes to agility, as I mentioned before, depending on the risk alert level, governance has to vary. Governance has to change. And as for disaster, I mean, we cannot completely avoid any disaster. So disasters do happen, and then we need resilience to recover from these disasters. In addition, as Dr. Kim mentioned, there are growing gaps, income gaps and gender gaps, and also gaps due to disabilities and regional gaps and generational gaps. So some people are at a different starting line, and so this is actually related to the behind the curtain theory. So for these socially vulnerable people, we need to have more inclusive policies. So we conducted a survey with 1,000 people. Agility and governance. There are 6 attributes of resilience and agility, as well as leadership. So these were included in the category of agility, and variability is included in the category of resilience. And we got feedback and input from the government agencies. Let's take a look at the findings because we are running short on time. When we take a look at the perception survey results, economic compensation was least favored. And of the response agencies, the agency that received the most negative perception was politicians. But then healthcare institutions and civil society, they were respected the most. Moving on to vaccine hesitation. People were afraid of abnormal vaccination reactions. And also they were not confident, they were not sure about the vaccination effect. And when we conducted a statistical analysis of the 6 variants, of the 6 variables, it is necessary to get rid of negative perception by focusing on the communication, because healthcare institutions receive the most trust. I already gave you the key lessons, key takeaways, so please remember them. So we conducted AHP analysis to develop a roadmap for future implementation, because we wanted to identify some of the key priority areas for improvement in terms of governance. So the number 1 area for improvement is redefining roles and responsibilities with more clarity, and also the legal system has to be improved. And public healthcare resources are not sufficient, so we need to expand and increase the medical resources, and we should also be able to utilize private sector resources by revising the laws. And also at the same time, we need to provide compensation for the private sector resources that are given to the public sector. And also it is critical to secure enough volume, doses of vaccine earlier on. So in the future, when we have another major infectious disease, we need to be able to secure enough vaccine doses for the public. And then we have the short-term, medium-term, and long-term tasks that we need to implement. And then we have the key findings. I hope that you will remember these key takeaways. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. So thank you for summarizing all the key findings in just 3 to 5 minutes so that we could all pay attention to the key messages. So that was very nice of you. Yes, we're still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are not out of the COVID pandemic yet. So I believe we need to continue to have critical reflection on our practices and our governance. We need to continue to evaluate what we are doing so that we can improve our responses. So evaluation and critical assessment is still very crucial. The Korean government and the public, the society have been responding to COVID-19, and she did a research study using a survey and an AHP analysis and so on. So thank you. But I hope all of you in the audience to remember the key findings that she mentioned early in the beginning of the presentation. Thank you.
네, 지금 두 번째 발제가
So the second presentation was talking about the state and social disasters and kind of severe disasters and how we were able to respond to them and how we must respond to them. But our third presentation, which will be delivered by Professor Avesalo Kusti from the University of Turku in Finland. This presentation is going to be focusing more on corporate crime. So corporate level of conflict. In fact, in Korea, as we heard from the first speaker, the number of industrial accidents is quite high here in Korea. And so I think we can all benefit from the presentation on how we can view corporate crime regarding safety. With that, we would like to turn to the presenter. Unfortunately, she is just joining us by Zoom. We can, if she could have come here to Korea and maybe seen the situation here in Korea, and also see us face-to-face, that would have been great. So it is quite unfortunate that we cannot see each other in person, and also because of the time difference. I know that it's very early there. Thank you so much for waking up early to be with us. Yes, and please let us know how you feel joining us on Zoom. Please let me know if you've ever visited Korea. Can you start your presentation now with just a few comments? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and greetings from Finland. I've never been in Korea, and I'm very sad that I cannot be there now. But thank you very much for inviting me to talk at your conference. I will talk about policing and punishing corporate crime in Finland. Before going to policing and punishing, based on my research, I'll tell a bit about the context and what I mean by corporate crime, and then finally I'll make some conclusions. As you know, Finland is a small nation, 5.5 million, a Nordic welfare state. And connected to the subject I'm talking about, Finland since 1996 has been the site of a coordinated series of quite successful governmental initiatives to combat different forms of corporate crime or economic crime, if you want to use that concept. But the focus here has been on what we call financial crimes. So when the police control crime, they aim mostly tax fraud, accounting offenses, dishonesty by a debtor, and various other types of fraud. And what is then lacking in this corporate crime control that not much focus is put on social crimes. I don't know, there's some echo here. I don't know if you can hear it. Maybe if I take my... Can you hear this echo? Or am I only hearing it? Take my-
괜찮습니다.
Yes, we don't hear the echo. Yeah.
So not all forms of corporate crime have been targeted. So-called social crimes, where the victims are employees and the general public, have been ignored in this fight against corporate crime. So where the victims have been market competitors, and businesses, those have been targeted, but not crimes where the victims are people, workers, and general public consumers. So what is important to note is that corporate activity not only causes financial harms when we talk about crime, but also lots of different kind of physical harms, which could be defined as corporate violence and has been done by many corporate crime criminologists. So these crimes cause death, injury, illness, etc. And I will focus today on corporate violence against workers, unsafe working conditions, but there are, of course, many other types of corporate crime which can be defined in this category of social corporate crime, such as unsafe environmental practices and unsafe products. So safety crime means a form of corporate violence where the employer neglects to take safety at work. And this corporate violence has been recognized and analyzed by many scholars, but they have remained quite invisible in crime prevention, despite all the harms and suffering they cause. Corporate crime is not really acknowledged as real crime or the suspects real criminals in these cases. So the individuals who are targeted are the usual suspects, if you look at the totality of crime control. And corporate violence is often sanitized with these metaphors such as spills, accidents, disasters, leaks, explosions, and so on. So I'll tell you now that about my research, and if we look at what the penal code in Finland, how it defines these crimes, we have a very clear criminalization in the penal code since 1995, where these incidents where safety is not taken care of at the workplace are punished. Even though these are laid down by law, these safety crimes, when we look at the police web pages on what kind of information to give when a crime has been committed, or if the victim wants to report a crime, we can see that this is a very traditional way of looking at crime. So this really doesn't fit when you want to report a safety crime, for example, in which direction, how the perpetrator fled the scene, for example. This is not something relevant to report when reporting a corporate crime, for example, a safety crime. So the perception of crime still is very strongly that it is an observable incident which happens in a certain place at a certain exact time. And an individual commits an intentional act and has a guilty mind. And there is a clear chain of cause and effect in these cases. So these common sense assumptions have, of course, close linkages to criminal doctrine, and they provide this conceptual framework of how safety crimes are perceived and understood by the police. So we did a study where we interviewed police who had investigated these crimes, and we also had other data, but I will focus on the interviews. Firstly, what we found before I tell about the interviews is that 80% of all incidents where something had happened at the workplace that could have been a crime were filed as non-crimes, as miscellaneous. So only a small percentage was defined as a possible crime by the police. When we interviewed the police, they were defined as accident and registered, as I said. And the police perception of these incidents, what they involve a lot of bad luck, and they focused a lot on the individual, that it is the individual who has done some mistake. And as one interviewee here said, who had investigated these for a longer time, that it took him 3 years to understand that they are crimes, not accidents. Also, there was strongly the perception within the police that these are not real criminals. They are not really awfully criminal. They are normal people who you can talk with, unlike with the usual suspects, which they defined as piles of shit. And also it was difficult when they talked with the CEOs with their ties and suits that to think of them as suspects because they didn't look like criminals. Also, this type of policing wasn't thought as being the most media sexy wanted police work. The police thought that it's probably a good place for police officer to want to slacken their pace and prepare for pension, or for a pregnant woman. So this wasn't thought to be like real manly police work. What was typical also was victim blaming. So they talked a lot about if the employees as people who have caused it themselves. And they, in the police reports, it was often mentioned when the case was not investigated that the victim blames themselves. And this clearly led to that the cases were not investigated. And also there was not much understanding of the corporate benefit in neglecting to take care of safety. So, well, if a railing at some construction site has not been built, what is the economic angle in that some worker falls and hurts his hand? So this shows again the very traditional way of looking at what is crime and not seeing in a broader time frame the omissions of the employer that may have been the cause for a worker to fall off a construction site. Finally, a few words on punishing. We studied cases where corporations were convicted of paying fines in case of safety crime. So in Finland, we have corporate criminal liability, which means the corporation can be fined up to 850,000 euros, and this means that the individuals can be punished in that case, but also the corporation itself can get a fine. And the idea when punishing individuals, in theory, is that it should always go to the management who have the possibility to take care, and then also the corporation can be punished. But when we look at this same figure, we see that only annually a very small proportion of safety crimes, it happens that the corporation is punished, even though in theory it could be punished every time. This is the same figure in another way presented. So we had 154 cases, and almost in every case, when the corporation got punished, also individuals were punished. And what was interesting, that when individuals were punished, they were low and middle management people, very seldom top brass. And the corporate fines were very low, constituting less than 0.1% of the annual turnover. The average fine was 10,700 euros, and the median was 5,000. And you remember the maximum could be 850,000. So just very, very small fines. Some conclusions. Well, what can explain this these kind of results, the under policing and under punishing of safety crime? Well, when we think about police culture and what police define, what is defined as police property, the things that police should deal with, is usually constituted around low status, powerless groups who dominant groups in society perceive as problematic. I mean, this could also be very clearly seen in the interviews. Also, the traditional sense of order and disorder, of a particular sense of order that the police officers are institutionalized in. So they are most concerned with instances of disorder between individuals. What me and my colleague David White have sort of theorized a bit is talk about structural readiness and conceptual readiness. So structural readiness means that what are the structures that are needed to police this type of crime? So the structures would mean like proper legislation, resources to investigate, and know-how, but then also the conceptual readiness is important, where the police officers, the police culture enhances that police indicate an ability to move beyond their conventional role of maintaining interpersonal disorder. So this would be a very important element. So what I think is that the conceptual readiness and the mind, even though these results are a bit pessimistic, what I showed you, that the conceptual readiness or mindset of police is not fixed. These can be changed over time. And when we think about, I told in the beginning that we have had successes in investigating in financial types of corporate crime, and that there was a big shift also in the structures. There was a big change, but also as time passed, also in the mindsets of what police started to perceive as real police work, and what they saw as real crime. Okay, thank you for your attention.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Avesalo Kusi. Yes, she is up very early, and yes, I was going to give you maybe about 5 more minutes, because you couldn't come here to Korea, but you've actually finished right on the dot, 15 minutes. So thank you for being so thorough and keeping to the time limit. Thank you so much. As you know, in Korea, in this year, in fact, there was an act on severe punishment for severe disasters and severe incidents. In fact, this act was enacted and it went into force this year. So in Korea as well, we understand that corporates could be penalized and found culpable for these kinds of crimes, including safety crimes. And so in Korea, at least the law is giving us a framework for which to crack down on these kinds of crimes. We have heard from the situation in Finland, and especially from the perspective of police officers, on how they view corporate crimes and specifically safety crimes committed by corporations and how they see them, how they view these crimes. And so it was a very practical, very alive kind of research results that you have given to us. So thank you very much.
이제 들었고
So all three presentations were given. Now I'm going to invite the three panel members who will discuss on these presentations, and they may also ask questions to the presenters. So as has been introduced, the first panel member is Professor Taegyun Yu, and he's going to be commenting on Dr. Kim's presentation. As has been introduced, I am Taegyun Yu. I'm very happy to meet you. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to express my thanks to the chairman of NRC for organizing this conference. I would also like to thank President Tae-soo Lee of the Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs for moderating the session, and it is an honor and pleasure to be part of this session. I enjoyed Dr. Kim's presentation. For more than 10 years, Dr. Kim has been conducting research, excellent research on bipolarization of Korean society in many aspects. So I understand that his presentation was based on some of the key results of his prior research. And in his presentation, he clearly shows where Korea is standing today in 2022 by using many social and economic indicators. So the numbers were quite impressive, and these were very clear in indicating where we are as a society. In addition to what he shared with us in his presentation, I'd like to add some more additional indicators to understand where we are right now. As Dr. Kim mentioned, our per capita GDP is more than $30,000, but in 1960, our per capita GDP was not even $90. And in 1977, the per capita income increased to $1,000. And in 1989, the figure went up to $5,000. And in 1995, it surpassed $10,000. And since then, we've seen steady increase of per capita income for Korea. So now Korea is number 10 in terms of its economic size. So there's a lot of advancement, but let's think about the distribution side. Many researchers have different views on how much welfare we have. But when you take a look at the legal system and programs, we have very good systems in place. We have 8 major social insurance systems, especially our public health insurance system is regarded very highly in the world. I'm not sure what Koreans think about this medical insurance, but it is highly regarded. But what about our status as a country? As Dr. Kim mentioned, in 2021 at UNCTAD, they finally designated Korea as an advanced country, no longer a middle country. And this is the first in the history of 57 years of the UN. What it means is that in the past, Korea received official development aid. So we used to be an ODA recipient, but we transformed ourselves into a donor country. And Korea is the only country that has been able to do so. So since the beginning of OECD DAC, or since the beginning of the UN, Korea is the first country that has transformed itself from an aid recipient to an aid donor country. So this is almost a miracle. And now we're recognized as an advanced economy, an advanced country. So for the past 7 decades, Korea has achieved enormous progress economically. But as Dr. Kim mentioned, when we go deep dive into our Korean society, there are many unfortunate aspects. Of the many indicators that Dr. Kim shared, I'd like to draw your attention to one particular indicator, which is the lowest fertility rate that we have among the OECD countries. So our birth rate is only 0.81, which means that our population is continuing to decline. The combined birth rate is 0.181, and this, I believe, is an indicator of how much hope the public has about the future. So when they see that there's bright future, they may want to have more babies. So this is an indicator for that. And in addition, as a social science scholar, I pay attention to many of the lagging indicators. And one of the key lagging indicators is the suicide rate. For the past 12 years, Korea was unfortunately number 1 among the OECD countries in terms of suicide rate. So we have 25.7 people committing suicide out of 100,000. So we have the highest suicide rate among the OECD countries. Why do we have such a low birth rate and such a high suicide rate? I mentioned that the fertility rate is about hope, and the suicide rate is a barometer that shows how much help is available for those who are in need, who are in despair. So it is unfortunate that the birth rate is the lowest and the suicide rate is the highest in Korea. So it means that we have hopeless and helpless society. That is the reality, a harsh reality that we are in. There are many researchers studying happiness, and they would conclude that happiness is basically about the difference between your expectation of what your life should be and what your actual life looks like. So how much of a difference there is between your expectation and your reality. So if there is a big difference, then people are not very happy. So there is a big difference between people's expectation and their reality in Korean society. And they believe that such a gap or difference will not be narrowed in the future. So there's no hope. Of course, it may run the risk of simplifying happiness, but still, I think it has implications. If we understand happiness and in terms of sort of working on definition, if we consider happiness as a difference between your expectation and reality, and if we see that there's not a lot of happiness among Korean people, it is very clear what policymakers and politicians have to do. Korea is currently a hopeless and helpless society. How can we change this? What do we need to do? We need to find answers to this question. And based on the answers, we need to find solutions. And we need to work together to change this. Then, of course, the question is how? What do we need to do? And how are we going to do that? As a researcher on social policies, for a very long time, I've been searching for an answer to this question. And recently, I came up with some principles, a couple of principles. So I want to share with you these 2 principles that I have in mind. but I would also later like to invite Dr. Kim to comment on them. So in addition to describing the current status, the current situation, I'm sure Dr. Kim has some good ideas as to what we can do to address the situation. So I would appreciate that if Dr. Kim can share with us his ideas on what we need to do. So going back to my two principles. The first one is, well, when you are a physicist studying quantum physics, they would say that the universe continues to expand. So there's an increase in entropy. The level of disorder continues to increase, and it is not fixed. So the universe is expanding in a disorderly manner. The universe is all about expansion and orderless expansion. So if that's the case, in Korean society, the first principle we need to remember is that we need to be more bold and aggressive in trying out new things that we were afraid of doing in the past. And some would say that these are creative disruptions or innovation, but I would like to argue that we need to break away from the mold that we've been in. We have to break out of the comfort zone and try drastically new ideas. We have so many social problems, including bipolarization and inequalities. These cannot be addressed on a case-by-cases, but we need a more higher level and meta-level approach to addressing these challenges. The second principle is, it may sound rather paradoxical, but I mentioned that we need to try something very different, but our focus should be on individuals rather than social structures. In other words, we should not focus on communities or governments or states, but rather we need to zoom in on to individuals and how we can help individuals realize their full potential. So that should be the key focal point. So these are the two principles that I want to share with you. And I would also like to Dr. Kim to comment on these. Thank you. Thank you very much. He laid out some of the ideas. There was no specific question, but he is asking Dr. Kim to comment on his ideas and also some of the solutions for the future. Thank you. Well, we have 21 minutes and 30 seconds left, and we cannot extend the session beyond that time. So for the two panel members, I would like to ask you to limit your remarks to 7 minutes so that we can go back to the presenters. Each presenter will be given 2 minutes, so then we can conclude the session in time. I'm sorry that I have to limit such a time. So the second panel member is Bae Jae-yeon from the National Assembly Research Service.
Yes, hello. My name is Jae-hyun Bae. And at my think tank, I focus on disaster prevention and particularly fire administration. We have been living in the COVID-19 situation for several years now. So I was able to really learn a lot from Dr. Ryu's presentation talking about our overall response to COVID-19, because if we were able to see from the title of the presentation, title of the research, is that this is really a massive kind of study. I also majored in public administration, so I was also awed by the fact that this is a huge research project. So just looking at the theme was quite astounding to me, because I don't understand how they were able to pull it off. But in any case, listening and reading the research, I have to say that I was able to learn a lot. And in the presentation, she began with the 6 lessons. And I think that the 6 takeaways really were implications that go above and beyond what I had first read in the research. So I don't exactly know what more I can bring to the table, but I would like to just offer a few comments, if I may. This research is on the disease management system that continues to evolve. I think that it's very difficult because these new and novel infectious diseases continue to come out all the time. So we need to take a near-term, mid-term, and long-term approach, and those different important considerations for each of the time terms. The research is quite meaningful, if I believe. The results on awareness, I think that almost everyone would be able to identify with the research results. The satisfaction on economic compensation, yes, I would think that it would be quite general, but early on, if we were to compare with US, Germany, and other countries, that those countries were very rapid in offering massive stimulus packages and massive support packages, but Korea was a little bit slow behind on that, and our packages were not as big. So I think that's why people were not as satisfied. If we were to look at the US had this various comprehensive packages offering $500, $1,200 cash, stimulus checks, and also Germany also offered a lot of rapid packages as well. In Korea, if we look at the support that Korea gave, the support checks, especially the cash checks, in the case of Germany, I don't think that they provided cash to all the people in Germany. And this is something that I was able to see as of the end of 2020. So maybe they did decide to give cash after that. But as of 2020, I understand that the cash payments were given to small businesses. And those small businesses had to prove that they actually suffered because of COVID-19. And if they could not prove it, they had to give back the money. And for the businesses, they would be given tax relief the next year if they didn't need the cash early on. But in the case of Korea, I know that the Korean government was really working out how much to give, whom to give to, but once they gave the cash, they didn't really do follow-up measures. They didn't identify or track down to see whether the cash really went to people who needed the money. And so I think that was unfortunate. And also with the vaccine hesitancy. Many people were very hesitant to take the vaccine because the vaccine development was fast-tracked, and I understand where the concern was. But if you look at the implementation roadmap, the process on side reactions reporting, I think that needs to be fast-tracked, as you mentioned, but also there needs to be a kind of reward for a side effect report. So if there are some vaccines that are provided, but there are some side effects from this fast-track vaccine, the state should step up and provide some kind of relief or compensation for the side effects. So the government is so quick to give out all these cash and stimulus checks to people, but they weren't really quick to provide compensation for people who reported that they suffered side effects because of the vaccine. I think that in these discussions with experts, they talk about early receipt, early shipments of the COVID-19 vaccines. And yes, that's important. But as we've heard, there are all these new novel infectious diseases that come out, and the cycle is going to be shorter. But we have to understand that these diseases are unique unto themselves. They're all very different. MERS was different. COVID-19 was different. So I think that we have to understand that the diseases themselves may be different. So we have to see this as a kind of checklist, all these different measures that we have to be mindful of, that they should be a kind of a checklist, and understand that we're going to check through the list. And if I were to just add one more thing, I was very much interested in going through COVID-19, that the Prime Minister's office headed the control tower for disaster countermeasures. because in the past, I think it was under another line ministry, but it was moved to the prime minister's office. It doesn't matter. It could be the prime minister or it could be a line ministry, but now the prime minister was put in charge of the COVID-19 control tower. But as COVID-19 became really prolonged, and then we saw excess heavy rainfall, this means that in the same period of COVID-19, there was this COVID-19, and then there was heavy rainfall. So when this happens, we should understand that the Prime Minister's office would be heading the control tower, but if there was a kind of natural disaster, then people turn to the Minister for Environment. Does that mean that we have two control towers? Or so this leads to a lot of confusion, I think, because we have to have one control tower, one control headquarters. So if we understand that there's going to be a lot of different kinds of conflicts and crises that come out, because after heavy rainfall in Korea, we saw extreme heat, and that led to other implications. Doctor, I'm sorry, but can you please wrap up? So I guess the important thing is that we can create small, I guess, control offices, but we have to have a single control headquarter. That is all. I'm sorry I had to cut in and cut short your intervention. Perhaps we can ask Dr. Yu to respond to that comment. Now we'd like to ask Dr. Yoon.
박사님께서 세 번째 알베살로.
Yes, Dr. Yoon, can you respond to Professor Alvesalo's presentation?
네, 안녕하세요. Thank you. Hello, I am Jung-suk Yoon at the Korea Institute of Criminology and Justice. I'm very happy to meet you via Zoom. So thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Alvesalo Kusi. At our institute, we have 60 researchers with doctorate degree, but we only have less than five people studying corporate crimes in our institute, so there's not enough attention to and research on corporate crimes. So it was very meaningful that she presented several key issues that we need to examine, and we could see that it requires a lot of research and something that researchers can continue to study in the future. I don't have much time, so I am going to read the prepared discussion. So your presentation presented reasons why we need to penalize corporate crimes. So you mentioned corporate violence, the term, and corporate violence may also lead to physical harm and economic harm, just like individual crimes. And also workers and consumers and employees, general public can experience damage or losses, and these may lead to illnesses and injuries, and also their family members can also be affected, including psychological impact and loss of jobs and many others. So there may be many different kinds of damages and losses caused by corporate crimes. So thank you very much. So safety crimes of corporates are perceived differently because the general public may consider them not as substantial crime but as accidents or unfortunate incidents. So there's no specific act of crime, so they don't know who is responsible, and middle managers or lower level managers would be responsible, but not the management or top management. So criminalization of such corporate crimes is not easy. And also the police perception was pointed out in the presentation. In Finland, there was a survey and interview with police officers, and they focus on crimes committed by individuals rather than corporates. And so it is not easy to investigate such cases because of the perception. And it reminds me of the Punishment Act on major industrial disasters. In Korea, we are notorious for high occurrence of industrial accidents and workplace accidents among the OECD countries. In order to prevent that, in January 2021, we have this major crime punishment act in the industrial sites, and in such a case, the CEOs and managements and high-level officials of governments can be penalized for such major accidents. So if more than one or two casualties occur, the management of the company may be up to 2 years in prison or more than 10 million won of penalty. But even after this law is enforced, it is applied to companies with more than 50 employees. But a lot of accidents occur in smaller companies with less than 50 employees. So this is a major limitation of the law. And it's not just the physical damage, but also psychological bullying and other traumatic experiences and stresses and psychological damages should be included in the law, according to some experts. In Korea, we have manufacturing industries and construction industries where accidents occur. But recently, a very famous bakery franchise factory, there was a worker who got injured severely in the manufacturing side of bakery goods. So a lot of people got really angry, and the CEO of this company got prosecuted, but this was not properly handled. So this is a major issue. There's another issue of Occupational Safety Act, and there was a major industrial accident. And so in order to strengthen safety, the law was revised. So the contract owner has to be responsible for any accident that occurs to employees of subcontractors. So the contract owner will be subject to 7 years in prison, or up to 5 billion won of fine. But according to a study, after the revision of the law, there are constant violations, but there was no actual sentencing done to those who were responsible for such accidents, and the average penalty was only 5 million won, even if the up to 5 billion won could be imposed. And there were many kind of ways of going around this law. So as Professor mentioned in the presentation, we still do not have a proper legal system that is able to protect our employees and general public from major safety accidents that occur in the workplace, which should be treated as corporate crimes. But strengthening the punishment itself may not solve the problem. Well, because now we have more severe punishment on the CEO, the CEOs may find other ways of avoiding their responsibilities, and they may not cooperate with the investigation process. And so in doing so, they may avoid their responsibility while not being able to take care of these situations. And some argue that we need to find a way to train the managers and the companies. So there are some researchers who argue that we need to impose mandatory training and education on the notion of safety. So in Finland, I can see that your kind of legal system is not enough, and there's under punishment of corporate crimes. But I believe that there are many examples in Finland. I wonder if there was any real prison term that was sentenced to the owner of a business that committed a corporate crime. So I wonder if there was any such case, and I wonder if there's actually a prison term imposed on these cases. And you also mentioned that police officers still have traditional concept of crimes, and I believe that we need to strengthen police capabilities. Currently, we have stalking and sex crimes and gender-based crimes within corporate environments. So we need to have police resources to be able to deal with them. And bullying and giving stress on lower-level workers, colleagues, they may be suffering from stress, and they may be in an unsafe work environment. So these also have to be subject to police investigation. But as you mentioned, I believe that we need more specialized and well-trained police officers who are able to deal with corporate crimes. So I hope that you will continue to conduct research on this issue in Finland. This will also help Korea. Thank you.
이제 그 발제자.
Okay, thank you. I believe it is now time for us to hear from the presenters, but we are out of time, so we're going to give time to Professor Avasarala Kusi first to respond. But before that, I think that Dr. Ryu, the Dr. Ryu also had something that she wanted to ask, so we're going to turn to her for a minute to hear her question, and then we will hear from Professor Avasalo Kusi for her feedback on that. So, Dr. Ryu, yes. So I'm going to end in 1 minute. Oh. My mother also she suffered from COVID-19 and she almost died. And I think that it was really blaming a victim in terms of COVID-19. And also, I think that there was expanded control headquarters for the expanded control headquarters, that was different. So that's what I wanted to ask. And to Professor Avasalo, in the UK, I know that there is a Corporate Crime Act, even for safety crimes. I was wondering if in Finland there is an act of corporate manslaughter or corporate murder. If there is an act like that, like in the UK, can you please respond?
한 3분 정도 드릴 수 있습니다.
We will give you 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments and questions. It was very interesting to hear what's going on in Korea in terms of this new law, etc. I was asked, has any CEO been put to prison? So no. The typical punishment is fine, and a quite low fine. and mostly indeed the low level or mid management get punished, not the CEOs. A corporate in UK there is indeed this Corporate Manslaughter Act. We don't have a specific Corporate Manslaughter Act. We have just corporate criminal liability, and then there are about 85 offenses in which you can punish the corporation. But what the reality is that it is very seldom enacted, this corporate criminal liability. In fact, it took 25 years for the law to pass. There was a big struggle between employers and employees, and the law was a bit watered down also. Then it had some changes, but the sort of same struggle that went on in the legislative process is going on in the implementation that it's quite seldom utilized. And I agree that strengthening punishment itself, of course, will not solve the problems. It would be also changing the corporate culture, etc. But if we want effective use of the criminal justice system, of course, the police are the key players in that the investigative phase is done well. I think I used my 3 minutes, but thank you very much for this conversation and the opportunity to discuss with you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Next, I'm going to give Dr. Kim 1 more minute to respond. Thank you. So hopeless and helpless society, yes, it's very sad and unfortunate, but thank you for your great discussions. I don't have much time, so I won't be able to respond to every single comment, but I'm going to make sure to reflect your comments into our research. The 2 principles, try new things, and secondly, we need to focus on individuals in terms of devising social welfare programs, and I believe that this is basically about how we can improve our social welfare programs, and I will take your input into account as we plan for research next year so that we can make our society better. Thank you. So yes, your answer was that you will conduct research on this. We're always running out of time when we have such seminars and conferences, especially when there is a follow-up session right after this. It is unfortunate that we don't have time to have more interactions, but I believe that this is not the end of our conversation. I believe that we will have another chance in the future to continue our discussion. So with that, we would have to wrap up today's session. The topic of the session is social cohesion and social safety. These are quite related, and there were 3 key presentations and 3 panel members. I really hope that we will have another opportunity in the future to discuss how we can promote better social cohesion and how we can nurture and promote social safety. And with that, let's conclude session number 5. I would like to thank you all for your active participation. Thank you, especially Anne. Thank you so much for joining us from Finland. Thank you. This is the end.
Reboot Korea.
Yes, thank you very much. That was Reboot Korea 2022. I don't know how the hour and a half flew by. We were discussing social cohesion and social safety, and with that, we would conclude this session. We talked about different kinds of conflict and division, and we also discussed some possible policy options to address this. The different policies that we have discussed today hopefully can lead to a foundation for a stronger, safer Korea next year. With this, we'll conclude this session on Reboot Korea 2022. However, as you know, there is a follow-up session after this because there was going to be a roundtable discussion after this session. So I'd like to ask you for your continued interest. I'd like to thank Mr. Lee, our moderator, as well as the presenters and the panelists. Please give them another big round of applause. Yes. So that was the 5th session. Thank you very much.
네, 잠시 안내 말씀드리겠습니다. 경제인문